Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her when he thought she wasn't listening. Just a nurse in wrinkled scrubs, restocking Band-Aids at Cherry Creek Mall in Denver, pushing a cart like she was invisible. He didn't know that the woman rotating inventory with surgical precision had once performed battlefield triage on a 6-year-old boy in Tikrit while artillery screamed overhead. He didn't know that her methodical documentation of supply discrepancies, the same defibrillator pads billed to insurance 3 times in a single month despite minimal actual use, meant she was building a case. Katie Morrison had been watching the numbers for 6 weeks now, and what she discovered wasn't carelessness. It was systematic fraud. And in exactly 4 days, everything would change. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above the medical aid station at Cherry Creek, a small clinic tucked between a Nordstrom and an Auntie Anne's pretzel stand. Katie arrived at 6:53 a.m., 17 minutes before shift start, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who didn't cut corners, who believed precision mattered, who understood that supplies weren't just inventory items but instruments that might save a life. She unlocked the supply closet with a key card that matched 12 others on a ring, each one a small weight in her scrub pocket, and stepped into the narrow space where boxes of gauze pads and elastic bandages stood in orderly rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, rotating the oldest stock to the front of the shelves. FIFO, first in, first out, a principle she'd learned in a military medical training facility that no longer existed, at a rank she could never publicly claim. The boxes whispered against the metal shelving as she worked, each movement precise, economical. No wasted motion. Never had been. She checked the expiration dates on the 4x4 gauze pads, good for another 8 months, and noted the lot numbers in a small leather notebook she kept in her left cargo pocket, the one with the broken zipper that she'd never bothered to replace because broken zippers were harder to notice than new ones. Behind the Band-Aids, she found them again. The defibrillator pads. Philips Heart Start Smart Pads, model M3860A, serial numbers for 47821, for 47822, and 447823. The same 3 units. The same lot that had been billed to insurance on June 3rd. Then again on June 10th. Then again on June 17th, despite the fact that the aid station used roughly 1 set of pads every 3 weeks, and those 3 sets had never left the shelf. She opened her notebook without removing it from her pocket, a habit from years of taking notes in rooms where it was better if people didn't see you writing, and updated her log. 3 times. 3 weeks. No actual use. No damage. No replacement notation in the maintenance log. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a ghost, that sharp chemical burn that never quite left your clothes or your hair. Katie had smelled worse. Much worse. The copper and iron smell of blood in a field hospital tent. The acrid smoke of diesel generators running 18 hours a day. The chalky dust of concrete and rebar after a blast. The antiseptic smell of Cherry Creek Mall's medical station was almost comforting by comparison. It meant precision, meant protocol, meant everything in its place. She was restocking the oxygen masks when she felt the shift in air pressure that meant someone was watching her. Not a patient. Not a colleague. Someone with authority. Someone with suspicion already forming like clouds before a storm. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway to the supply closet, his white coat pressed with the kind of care that suggested his wife ironed it, his cologne arriving 3 seconds before his body did, something expensive that smelled like money and ambition mixed together. "Good morning, Katie," he said, his voice smooth as clinic-grade hand sanitizer. "You're here early again." "Supply rotation," she replied, her hands continuing their work without pause. Rotating the smart pad boxes. Checking lot numbers. Documenting. Stock expires October 18th if we don't use it. He stepped closer, and she felt rather than saw him glancing at her hands, at the notebook tucked into her pocket, at the meticulous arrangement of medical equipment that spoke of military discipline rather than retail efficiency. His jaw tightened. Almost imperceptibly. But Katie had been trained to notice micro-expressions in combat zones where the difference between a smile and a threat measured in millimeters. "You're awfully thorough with those records," Sterling said, his tone shifting from pleasant to something with teeth hidden underneath. Some might call it obsessive. Katie set down the defibrillator pads and turned to face him, her movements fluid as a closing door. She met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than the threats implied in a shopping mall manager's narrowed gaze. One measured breath. In. Out. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. "I believe in accuracy, Dr. Sterling," she said quietly. Her voice had dropped slightly lower than her speaking register, not threatening, not confrontational, just stating fact. The voice of someone who understood the weight of proper documentation. Supplies are resources. Resources should be tracked. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that came right before someone began calculating how to make a problem disappear. He glanced down at her pocket where the notebook edge was barely visible, then back at her face, and in that moment Katie understood with absolute clarity that he knew. Not all of it. But enough. He knew she was noticing things. Connections. Discrepancies. The phantom billing that had been funding his salary supplement and the remodeled master bathroom and whatever else he'd decided he deserved. "Well," Sterling said, the word hanging in the air like a threat disguised as conversation, "I'm sure everything is perfectly fine. Just being thorough. I like that in my team. Loyalty. Attention to the big picture. Understanding what's really important." He paused, letting that weight settle between them. "And what isn't?" Katie said nothing. Saying nothing was often the most powerful response. She returned to her inventory rotation, her hands moving with the same mechanical precision, and Sterling watched her for another 7 seconds, she counted, before he turned and left, his cologne lingering in the space like a territorial mark. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she finished her inventory count 32 minutes later and discovered something worse than phantom billing. Much worse. In the maintenance log that Sterling updated personally each month, the log that was supposed to track every defibrillator pad used, replaced, or damaged, there was a second entry. One she hadn't seen before. 5 units billed. 5 units documented as delivered. 5 units that cost $1,240 per set, times 5, equals $6,200 in a single transaction. And the delivery date was a Thursday in early May, during Katie's day off, signed for by Sterling's initials. She opened her notebook slowly, her hands remaining steady despite the way her stomach had tightened into a fist. Added the numbers. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Phantom pads. Fictitious deliveries. Insurance claims submitted under hospital letterhead that weren't actually for hospital use. Over the past 6 months, this pattern appeared to total somewhere in the range of $47,000. Maybe more. She'd need to verify with the actual insurance submissions, but those would require access she didn't have. Not yet. The radio on her belt crackled, a customer had fallen near the fountain on the 2nd level, possible sprain, vitals requested. Katie closed her notebook and clipped it back into her pocket with the same care she'd used securing a classified file. She stood, straightened her scrubs, and grabbed the portable oxygen unit and her first aid kit with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times in contexts far more dire than a shopping mall. As she wheeled toward the door, her eyes flickered to the bottom of her locker, where the pair of worn combat boots sat laced and waiting, caked with dust that no amount of washing could completely remove. Tikrit dust. The dust of a place and a time that officially didn't exist, that had been erased from records and sealed under classification orders that would remain sealed for another 18 years. She could see the worn leather, the scuffed toes, the fraying laces that she'd replaced 3 times over 2 decades. She locked the storage closet and headed into the mall, moving through the bright corridors of retail America toward the 2nd-level fountain where a tourist family was kneeling beside a middle-aged woman clutching her right ankle. Katie's mind had already shifted from Dr. Sterling's calculated stare and phantom billing schemes to the present emergency, her training taking over like muscle memory reasserting itself. By the time she was kneeling beside the injured woman, she was no longer Katie Morrison, the tired medical tech in wrinkled scrubs. She was pure function. Pure response. Pure competence. She didn't know it yet, but in exactly 72 hours, everything she'd documented, everything she'd noticed, and everything she'd tried so carefully to keep hidden would collide with the arrival of a young Army Ranger who collapsed in this very mall with a tension pneumothorax, gasping like a fish pulled from water, his left lung collapsing inside his chest while the pressure built and built and built. And when she saved his life without authorization, without thinking, using a ballpoint pen and the kind of clinical precision that revealed exactly what she'd spent 20 years trying to conceal, Dr. Sterling would make a choice that would destroy him. The diabetic woman collapsed mid-stride near the food court, her glucose monitor screaming a warning Katie had learned to read in her sleep. 52. Her husband caught her before she hit the marble, and Katie was already moving, her hand steady as surgical steel as she knelt beside them. "I'm Katie, I'm a medical professional. Mrs. Chen, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Katie reached for the glucose tabs in her pocket, always there, always ready, and placed 3 under the woman's tongue. Sublingual absorption. Fastest route without an 4 line. She checked the woman's radial pulse. Thready but present. "Someone call 911, Katie said, her voice the calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She was monitoring Mrs. Chen's airway when she heard the footsteps. Expensive shoes. Deliberate pace. Dr. Sterling materialized through the crowd like a storm front rolling in, security trailing behind him, and behind them, Mrs. Chen's husband with his face twisted in confusion and alarm. "What's happening?" "Is she?" the husband started. Dr. Sterling placed a hand on his shoulder. "Protective. Practiced. Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry, Katie here is still in training and shouldn't have administered anything without direct supervision." His voice dripped with concern, the kind that sounds like honey and tastes like poison. Katie's hand stilled for one breath. Just one. She kept her eyes on Mrs. Chen's color, already improving, pink returning to her cheeks as glucose entered her bloodstream. Katie spoke without looking up. Mrs. Chen presented with acute hypoglycemia at 52 mg DL. Standard protocol for emergency glucose administration. She's stabilizing. Her voice was measured. Professional. The mask held perfectly in place. But Dr. Sterling was already shaking his head at the gathering crowd, at Mrs. Chen's family, at every shopper within earshot of the food court. Standard protocol is not freelancing, Nurse Nightingale. The nickname hit like a blade. Nightingale. Florence Nightingale. Except the way he said it, it meant someone small. Decorative. Playing at nursing instead of actually doing it. Katie Morrison is now on probationary status effective immediately for unauthorized treatment of this patient. He turned to Mrs. Chen's husband with a sorrowful expression. "I apologize that she overstepped. This won't happen again." Katie's jaw clenched. One measured breath. She wiped her hands on her scrubs and stood, turning to face Dr. Sterling with her eyes level and her posture straight. A single tear escaped, just one, the kind that comes from fury held so tight it crystallizes into something harder than diamond. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it. Then she spoke, her voice dropping an octave. "I've worked on patients you couldn't imagine, in places you'll never see." She turned back to Mrs. Chen without waiting for his response. The crowd had gone quiet. That particular quiet that comes right before something shatters. Dr. Sterling's face darkened like a bruise spreading under skin. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The security guard looked away. Mrs. Chen squeezed Katie's hand and whispered, "Thank you," and her husband's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. But Dr. Sterling was already on his phone, already walking away, already building the narrative that would arrive 3 days later in writing. The break room became a place Katie stopped visiting. Mike and Jennifer, her colleagues of 3 years, suddenly developed urgent inventory tasks the moment she sat down with her lunch. Monday she brought a sandwich. Mike remembered the bandage restock. Tuesday she brought yogurt. Jennifer urgently needed to check expiration dates on the 4 lines. Wednesday she brought nothing at all and just sat with coffee, watching them gather their half-eaten meals and find reasons to be elsewhere. By Friday, the pattern was so established that it barely registered as betrayal anymore. It was just gravity. It was just how things fell. But Friday was also when Dr. Sterling posted the notice. It appeared on the public bulletin board next to the food court, where every passing shopper could see it. White paper. Official letterhead. Her name in capital letters. Katie Morrison, probationary status, unauthorized medical decisions. A teenager in a mall security polo pointed at it and whispered to her friend. A woman photographed it with her phone. 2 teenagers laughed about that nurse lady being in trouble. Katie walked past it without slowing her pace, without flinching, without any visible reaction at all. Her hands didn't shake until she was alone in the locker room. She opened her locker with a combination she'd used for 3 years, and there they were. The boots. Worn leather the color of old blood, the soles cracked and dirt embedded, laces frayed at the ends. Combat boots from Tikrit, from 20 years ago, from a life that was supposed to stay buried. She'd brought them to Denver wrapped in a shopping bag at the bottom of her moving box, and she'd never worn them once. She just looked at them. Just kept them where she could see them if she needed to remember who she actually was. The door opened. Dr. Sterling stood in the frame, his reflection appearing behind hers in the mirror beside her locker. "Maybe you're just not cut out for real medical work, Katie," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Some people peak early. Some people just aren't built for this." He smiled like he was comforting her. Like he was doing her a favor by suggesting she should quit. Katie lifted her eyes from the boots to his reflection. One measured breath. She closed her locker carefully and turned to face him directly. "Some people never peak at all," she said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically. Just barely. Like someone flipping a switch in another room. The smile vanished from his face. He left without another word, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to break teeth. That night, Katie sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment on the outskirts of Denver, her 12-year-old daughter Emma asleep upstairs after asking why Mommy was home 3 hours early. Katie had told her there was a scheduling change. A small lie. A necessary one. She held her phone in one hand and stared at nothing. The boots were still in her locker. The notice was still on the bulletin board. The combat boots were still the only thing she owned from a life where she'd saved people in ways that left no paper trail, in places that no longer appeared on maps. She was restocking the bandage cart in the station Thursday morning when the sound came, a thunderous crash that echoed through the mall's main concourse like a car hitting a building. Shouting. Screaming. The sound of panic spreading through a crowd like fire through dry grass. Katie's hands moved before her mind caught up. She was already running. The bandage cart could wait. Everything could wait. She pushed through the crowd gathering near the marble entrance. A young man lay on his back, his Army Ranger dress uniform gleaming with medals under the fluorescent mall lights. His lips were blue. His chest was rising only on the left side. Tension pneumothorax. The right lung was collapsed, and every breath he took was filling his chest cavity with air instead of oxygen. He had minutes. Maybe less. "I need a ballpoint pen," Katie said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Hollow barrel. Now." A businessman handed her one without asking questions. Katie didn't think about probationary status or Dr. Sterling or the notice on the bulletin board. She thought about Tikrit. She thought about a 6-year-old boy with a collapsed lung, bleeding out in the dust, and hands that knew exactly what to do because they'd done it 1,000 times before in the dark. She broke the pen. Discarded the ink cartridge. Poured hand sanitizer across the hollow barrel, rough sterilization, the best she could do. She found the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, and positioned the needle with the kind of precision that only comes from muscle memory so deep it's written into your bones. "Stay with me, Ranger," she whispered. She pushed the needle through skin, through tissue, felt the resistance give way. Air hissed out in a thin, desperate stream. The sound of a lung re-inflating. The ranger gasped, his eyes rolling back as oxygen finally reached his brain again. His color flooded back like someone turning up the saturation on a photograph. The crowd erupted in applause. A woman screamed for paramedics. Katie stayed kneeling, her fingers monitoring his breathing, checking his pupils with a penlight she pulled from her pocket. She noticed his name tape. Darwish. Captain James Darwish. Army Ranger. Alive. That's when she heard Dr. Sterling's voice cutting through the applause like a scalpel. What the hell did you just do? He was already on his phone. Already pacing. Already making calls to corporate first, his voice rising with each word. We have a massive liability situation. A medical technician just performed an authorized emergency surgery in our mall. Then to the insurance liaison. Then to someone he golfed with on the hospital board. Then to his lawyer. For calls. Each one building the same architecture of accusation. Reckless. Unauthorized. Untrained. Playing doctor. Exposure nightmare. His words moved like oil spreading across water, and Katie knelt beside a soldier whose life she'd just saved, listening to the man who managed the station build the case for her destruction. But that wasn't the worst part. The marble floor exploded. Not literally. But the sound of a human body hitting polished stone at full velocity carries a specific kind of finality, a wet, sickening crack that stops conversation mid-sentence and pulls every eye toward the center of Cherry Creek Mall's main concourse. Shoppers froze. A mother grabbed her child. Someone screamed. Katie was moving before her brain caught up. She vaulted over a bench, her work shoes finding grip on the slick floor, and pushed through the gathering crowd with the kind of authority that made people step aside without thinking. 23 years of muscle memory didn't ask permission. It just moved. The man on the marble was young. Dress uniform, Army Ranger insignia on his shoulder, the kind that meant he'd been somewhere hot and terrible and had lived through it. His lips were already blue. His chest rose on the left side. The right side didn't move at all. Classic. Unmistakable. Tension pneumothorax. Call 911, Katie said. Her voice was flat, quiet. A statement, not a request. A businessman with an expensive watch fumbled for his phone. She dropped beside the ranger without touching him yet, her eyes cataloguing, skin turgor, distension in the neck veins, trachea shifted slightly toward the left. The right lung had collapsed and was now pressing against his heart like a fist inside a cage. I need a pen. Ballpoint. Now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. A teenager with blue nail polish held out a Bic from her purse. Standard plastic barrel. Fine point. Perfect. Katie pulled her hand sanitizer from her pocket, the small bottle she carried in her scrubs, and wiped the barrel methodically. 3 seconds. Not medical protocol. Medical protocol required a sterile field. Medical protocol also assumed you had surgical instruments and a clean environment and the luxury of time. None of those things existed on marble floors at 2:27 in the afternoon surrounded by an audience of strangers. Pain is data. She'd learned that in Tikrit, where there were no sterile fields, only the choice between doing something and watching someone die. She palpated his chest with her left hand, finding the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks that every battlefield medic spent months learning to locate without instruments, without x-rays, without anything but touch and the knowledge that 80 seconds of doing nothing was a death sentence. The ranger's eyes found hers. Terrified. Drowning in his own collapse. I've got you, Katie said. Just breathe. She drove the ballpoint needle through skin, through fascia, through the pleural space. The resistance gave way like puncturing a membrane. And then, the hiss. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound of a lung re-expanding like a balloon being filled from the inside. The ranger's chest heaved. His lip color shifted from blue toward something approaching human. His right eye closed. His breathing came in gasps, but they were breaths. She kept her hand steady on the needle, letting it serve as a temporary chest tube while his oxygen saturation climbed. 68. 72. 80. The pulse ox on a shopper's dropped phone registered each improvement. Paramedics en route, the businessman announced, phone still pressed to his ear. 2 minutes. The crowd had gone silent. That particular silence that only exists in the moment immediately after someone doesn't die. The air pressure in the concourse seemed to change, the way it shifts before a thunderstorm. The ranger's hand reached up. His fingers closed around Katie's wrist, and he managed 3 words, "Thank you." "Thank you." She didn't respond. She was counting. Monitoring his breathing depth. Watching for any sign that the needle had shifted, that pressure was building again. 117 seconds until the paramedics would arrive. She could hear their siren now, distant, getting closer. That's when the footsteps came. Rapid. Angry. The particular cadence of someone moving through a crowd with the expectation that people would scatter, and they did. Dr. Sterling emerged from the crowd like something boiling over, his face the color of raw meat, his eyes fixed on Katie with the intensity of pure rage. "What are you doing?" His voice was loud enough that the remaining shoppers pulled back further, creating a wider circle. "That is not you have no authorization." "Doctor, this patient was in cardiac arrest from tension pneumothorax." Katie kept her eyes on the ranger's chest. Right-sided collapse, tracheal deviation, JVD present. Decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Needle catheter in place. Vital stabilizing. The words came out in military precision. Briefing an officer. Just facts. Just data. Sterling's face went from red to a shade of purple that suggested his cardiovascular system was approaching its own crisis. That is textbook insubordination. "You are not authorized to perform any procedure on a patient without." The ranger's voice cut through. Weak, but carrying the kind of authority that comes from having given orders under fire. "She saved my life." The paramedics burst through the main entrance then, 2 of them, a woman with gray-streaked hair and a man with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd been doing this job since before Katie was born. They moved like people who understood crisis. They moved like people who'd seen things. The gray-haired paramedic knelt beside Katie, her eyes taking in the scene in half a second, the makeshift needle, the patient's improving color, the practiced steadiness of Katie's hands. "Who did this?" "I did," Katie said. "Tension pneumothorax, right side, decompressed at 14:23, patient responsive, airway clear, sinus rhythm, O2 sat 92 and climbing." The paramedic's eyes moved from the needle to Katie's face. Recognition flickered there, not of her face, but of what her words meant. She'd just spoken in the language of someone who'd done this before. Someone who'd done this in places where there was no hospital, no backup, no margin for error. "That's textbook battlefield trauma protocol," the paramedic said slowly. "Where'd you learn?" "She learned nothing." Sterling's voice came from the edge of the circle, sharp and cutting. "This woman is a medical assistant. She is not certified to perform any procedure. She's endangered this patient's life. This is assault. This is a liability nightmare." The ranger grabbed Katie's wrist tighter. "That's bullshit." But Katie had already seen Sterling's hand moving, reaching into his pocket for his phone. She knew that gesture. She'd watched him make calls yesterday that had cost her the posting of a humiliating notice. She'd heard him on the phone with board members, constructing narratives, building cases with the kind of methodical precision that came from having practiced this skill before. The paramedics were already moving, already preparing to transport, their focus on the patient and the treatment. They didn't have time for institutional politics. But Sterling did. Sterling had nothing but time. Katie released the needle carefully to the paramedic's hands, and Sterling was already dialing. She heard him before he even spoke, the urgency in his posture, the decision in the line of his shoulders. He wasn't going to wait for investigations. He wasn't going to give her a chance to explain herself. He was going to move faster than any official process could match. The paramedics loaded the Ranger into the ambulance, his eyes still fixed on Katie as they wheeled him away, and Sterling was already on his second call. She heard fragments, unauthorized medical procedure, and immediate liability review, and grounds for termination. By the time the ambulance doors closed, her phone buzzed. An email from her direct supervisor. Corporate. Subject line, urgent, investigation pending. The marble floor beneath her feet felt exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. But everything else had changed. She understood that now, standing there in her scrubs while Sterling paced the perimeter of the crowd, making calls, building his narrative, ensuring that the woman who had just saved a life would pay for it. The silence that followed, after the Ranger was gone, after Sterling had finished his calls, after the crowd dispersed back to their shopping, that silence was the loudest thing Katie had ever heard. Security escorted Katie to her locker at 4:27 p.m. She cleared it in 90 seconds, a water bottle, a half-eaten protein bar, 2 pens. Dr. Sterling stood 15 feet away with his arms crossed, watching her like a vulture. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. His breathing was shallow, the kind of breathing a man does when he's terrified that someone might survive him. The cardboard box felt weightless in her hands. That was the problem with boxes, they were honest. Empty boxes always weighed nothing. Katie walked to the parking garage alone. The fluorescent strips overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made the world look like it was already dead. She sat in her car for 20 minutes. The key hung in the ignition. Her hands rested on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions, the way she'd been taught in a classroom she couldn't name on a military base she was no longer allowed to speak about. Rain had started falling, a soft October drizzle that pattered against the windshield like Morse code. Tap tap tap. Tap tap. Tap. She had saved a life. That was the fact. That was the only fact that mattered. And they had fired her for it. Katie turned the key. The engine caught. She drove home to an address in Cherry Creek, to a small brick house with a green door and a daughter waiting at the kitchen table with homework spread across the surface like evidence. The clock on the dashboard read 7:31 p.m. when Katie walked through the front door still wearing her scrubs. The scrubs were important. Emma would notice. Emma noticed everything, the small things adults missed, the details that children collected like stones in their pockets. One blue scrub top, cotton blend, stained at the left shoulder with something that might have been iodine. One pair of scrub pants with a hole in the pocket where Katie's work badge used to clip. No badge now. No pockets that meant anything. Emma looked up from her math homework, and Katie watched her daughter's face shift through the spectrum of confusion in real time. Confusion, then concern, then something that looked like fear. Mommy. Emma's voice was small. Smaller than it had been that morning. Why aren't you at work? Katie set the cardboard box down on the kitchen floor. It made a sound like surrender. I need to sit down, sweetheart, Katie said. Emma's eyes went wider. She was 12, old enough to know that when mothers used the word the sweetheart in that particular tone, something had broken. Emma pushed her math homework aside and waited. Katie pulled out the chair across from her daughter and sat down. The table was oak. Katie had picked it out 6 years ago at a furniture store. 6 years ago, she had stood in that store and thought about stability, about normal things that normal people bought. Now the table felt like evidence of a life that had never actually existed. I lost my job today, Katie said. Emma's expression crumpled. Not in a dramatic way. Just a small folding inward, the way a flower closes at dusk. Did you do something wrong? No, Katie said. I did something right. I helped someone who was hurt very badly, and the words stopped. They hit a wall somewhere in her chest. Katie's hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. Her voice was a thing that betrayed people. And they didn't like how I did it. That's not fair, Emma said. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. You're the best nurse. You always helped everyone. Katie nodded. She couldn't trust her voice again, so she didn't speak. Emma got up from her chair and moved around the table, and Katie felt her daughter's thin arms wrap around her shoulders. Emma smelled like strawberry shampoo and the pencil eraser she'd been chewing on. She smelled like the only innocent thing in the world. Katie's eyes burned. One tear escaped, just one, because anything more would be a choice, and she wasn't making choices anymore. She was being made by circumstance now. She was clay being shaped by the hands of men like Dr. Sterling who knew her vulnerability but not her spine. I'm sorry, baby, Katie whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Emma said. You didn't do anything wrong. They're just mean. Katie held her daughter and said nothing, because the truth would destroy her, and this moment where Emma still believed that right things happen to right people, this was the last moment of childhood either of them would have. Tomorrow, Emma would understand that goodness was not a shield. That helping people could get you erased. That night, Katie unpacked the cardboard box in her bedroom. She placed the water bottle in the recycling. The protein bar in the trash. The 2 pens in a drawer. And then, at the bottom of the box, her fingers found something that made her breath catch. Combat boots. 20 years old, the leather cracked and faded to the color of old rust. She had kept them hidden in her work locker, tucked behind her extra shoes, the only piece of her actual life that she'd allowed in that place. The boots that had walked the streets of Tikrit when she was someone else, someone who didn't have a daughter waiting for her to come home. Katie sat on her bed with the boots in her lap and didn't move until 2:17 a.m. The next 2 days dissolved into blur and automatic motion. She updated her resume at the kitchen table while Emma slept upstairs, scrubbing out any detail that might hint at her actual capabilities. Level for trauma response. Advanced battlefield medicine. She didn't write those things. She wrote phlebotomy and a patient transport and the quiet lies of a woman learning to be small again. She applied to 3 urgent care clinics in the Denver metro area. Rejection emails came back within hours. Her reference from Cherry Creek Mall's management was a catastrophe, a black mark that spread like ink in water. Emma asked questions. When do you go back, and did they say sorry? And finally, on the 3rd morning, just are you okay? Katie gave her the answers that mothers are supposed to give, soft lies about everything being fine, about adults handling things, about the world being basically fair if you just waited long enough. The grocery store was where the phone call came. Katie was standing in the cereal aisle, staring at boxes without reading them, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. The kind of number that belonged to people who existed outside normal channels. Ms. Morrison. A man's voice. Military bearing in every syllable, even through cellular compression. This is Captain James Darwish. I'm at Oak Creek Memorial, VA wing. I need you to come here. Katie's throat tightened. The cereal box slipped from her hands and hit the floor. Raisin bran scattered across the tile like confetti at a funeral. Captain, I can't, I'm not. Please, he said. Just that word. Just please. There's someone here who flew from Iraq. He needs to see you. The line went quiet. Then dial tone. Katie picked up the cereal box and left it on a shelf. She left the grocery store. She drove to Oak Creek Memorial without changing out of her jeans and gray sweater, clothes that made her feel naked, exposed, like an imposter pretending to be civilian. The VA wing had its own entrance. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like breath leaving a body. Captain Darwish was waiting in the lobby, arm in a sling, a line of stitches visible on his jaw. He looked smaller than he had in the mall. All trauma victims looked smaller after they survived it, as if the experience had burned away the unnecessary parts. Thank you for coming, he said. Not a question. A fact, stated with the precision of someone accustomed to military certainty. He led her down a hallway painted the particular shade of institutional blue that was supposed to be calming. It had never calmed anyone. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic ghost of blood that never completely washed out. They stopped at a private room. "Senior Chief Morrison," Captain Darwish said, and the words fell like stones. "I think you're about to have your entire life validated and destroyed at the same time." He opened the door. The man in the wheelchair was brown-skinned, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone who had survived things and carried them like medals. When he saw Katie's face, his hands flew to his mouth. His eyes widened to the size of comprehension, the moment when the past walked into the present tense and forced the two to reconcile. "Impossible," he whispered in English with an Iraqi accent that bent certain vowels like grief. "The Angel of Tikrit. You saved my life when I was 6 years old." Katie's knees went soft. The boy. The one she had pulled from rubble while mortars cracked overhead like thunder. The arterial bleed she had controlled with her bare hands, with pressure and prayer and the kind of muscle memory that never leaves your body no matter how hard you try to bury it. She had sutured his brachial artery with equipment that wasn't designed for surgery, with lights that came from a Humvee's headlamps, with hands steady as stone because if her hands shook, the boy died. You were. Katie couldn't finish the sentence. The man stood from the wheelchair. He could stand. The wheelchair was choice, not necessity, and took Katie's hand in both of his. His hands were soft. An educated man's hands. A diplomat's hands. Not the hands of a child bleeding out on dust. "I am Dr. Rashid Qasim," he said. "Now cultural attaché for the Iraqi mission. I have searched for you for 20 years. Every death certificate. Every military record. I thought you had died in Baghdad." Captain Darwish came to attention beside them. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison." The word suspended everything. Katie's entire civilian identity ceased to exist. A door opened. A nurse entered, her hands trembling, carrying a file thick as a novel. The file that wasn't supposed to exist. The file that had been erased from every database, every archive, every historical record, so that a woman named Katie Morrison could spend 20 years pushing a medical cart and nobody would ever know that she had once commanded rooms full of soldiers, that she had once been trusted with classified operations so sensitive that even now, the details remain sealed. Katie opened the file with fingers that felt numb. Navy Cross. The words were written in ink that had been official once. Extracted 17 wounded soldiers under fire in Fallujah, March 2004. A photo showed a younger Katie in dress whites at a ceremony she had never been allowed to acknowledge. No newspaper had printed the photo. No family had framed it. It had existed only in the sealed records of an institution that had ordered her to disappear. The door opened again. A woman in navy dress uniform, ribbons covering her chest in a geometry of Vela. She looked at Katie and nodded with the kind of respect that made the room smaller. Senior Chief Morrison received the Navy Cross for extracting 17 wounded soldiers under fire in Fallujah, the officer said. Each word fell like a judgment, like a sentence being read aloud after decades of silence. Katie couldn't breathe. She was drowning in air. Another person entered. A SEAL commander with scars on his neck and the kind of posture that came from having survived wars. He stood beside the Navy officer and spoke. Silver Star for classified operations in Tikrit that saved 43 coalition and Iraqi civilian lives. Rashid gripped Katie's hand tighter. An FBI agent in a dark suit entered last, as if credentials had to be shown in descending order of institutional power. Federal power always entered last. Federal power didn't need to announce itself. Senior Chief Morrison carried out assignments so sensitive they remain sealed under federal order, the agent said. His voice sounded like redacted documents had learned to speak. Her official records were erased for national security. She was ordered to disappear. For 20 years, she has been invisible. Silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a bomb before detonation. Then Dr. Sterling's voice from the doorway. "What is this?" "Corporate sent me to address the liability." He stopped. His mouth opened like a hinge with nothing behind it. He saw the uniforms. The federal agent. The diplomatic credentials. He saw a woman he had fired for saving a life, standing in a room full of people who had watched her save lives at a scale he couldn't comprehend. The Navy officer turned toward him with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that made everything else feel fast. "And you are?" she asked. Dr. Sterling's face cycled through colors, red, white, and finally the particular shade of gray that comes when a man realizes he has made a mistake he cannot make. Katie's footsteps echoed down the corridor of Oak Creek Memorial's VA wing, each step measured, deliberate, the kind of gait that comes from 20 years of moving through spaces where hesitation means death. The air smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the particular staleness of a hospital that never quite closes. Captain Darwish stood in the lobby near the elevator, his left arm wrapped in bandaging that caught the fluorescent light like fresh snow. He smiled when he saw her, the smile of a man who'd just learned he'd been saved twice in his lifetime and didn't know it yet. "Senior Chief," he said quietly. Just those two words, but his voice carried the weight of protocol, the weight of rank, the weight of knowing. "Thank you for coming." Katie nodded once, a sharp economical movement. "How's the lung?" "Perfect reinflation." "You did that?" He gestured toward a room down the corridor. "There's someone who needs to see you." The wheelchair sat near the window, silhouetted against Denver's afternoon light slanting through the glass. An older man, early 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His suit was expensive, charcoal wool, silk tie, the kind of precision tailoring that whispered money and position. But his hands trembled as they gripped the wheelchair's armrests. And his eyes. His eyes went wide the moment Katie stepped into the room. The man in the wheelchair stared at her face like he was reading the answer to a question that had haunted him for 4 decades. His breathing changed. His mouth opened. And then his voice came out soft, fractured, a whisper that carried the weight of decades, the Angel of Tikrit. "You saved my life when I was a child." The room stopped. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them like insects frozen mid-flight. Katie's composure, that iron-backed, battle-hardened composure that had carried her through 2 decades of invisibility, remained absolutely intact. Not a flinch. Not a tremor. She simply stood there, present, while the man in the wheelchair stared at the woman she had been 20 years ago, the woman who'd held a bleeding 6-year-old boy in her hands under fire in a place the world had already forgotten. Captain Darwish stood at attention. The movement was sharp, precise, the kind of stand that transforms a room's gravity. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," he said, his voice now cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Not a question. A statement of fact. A statement of rank. A statement of who she actually was. The door opened wider. The woman who stepped through wore navy dress whites, gold leaf on her shoulders catching the light like a weapon. Her jaw was the kind of jaw that could cut glass, her presence making the air pressure in the room shift downward with the weight of command. She held a folder. Katie recognized it immediately. The kind of folder the government uses for things that were supposed to stay buried. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison," the officer said, her voice smooth and precise as a scalpel. "Navy Cross. For extracting 17 wounded soldiers under fire during Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2004. The officer opened the folder with ceremonial deliberation. Each medal was its own moment. Silver Star. For classified operations in Tikrit, same deployment. A pause. The world balanced on that pause. 2 Purple Hearts. And commendations from JSOC Task Force 121 that the FBI still has sealed. Katie's breathing remained steady. Her hands did not shake. But her eyes finally moved, finally broke from that iron composure, and looked at the framed photograph the officer was now holding. A 6-year-old boy, dust-covered and bleeding, being held by a woman in field scrubs. And beside it in the same frame, the grown man in the wheelchair, smiling, standing beside Katie at what looked like a military ceremony, both of them in dress uniforms. That was when the footsteps came from the hallway. Heavy. Panicked. Running. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face already cycling through colors like a mood ring of catastrophe. The hospital's corporate representatives had called him in person, had said the words federal agents and military investigation, and he'd come because in that moment he still believed in his ability to spin, to explain, to construct a narrative that could survive contact with reality. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, and what came out was less a voice and more a sound, the sound of a man realizing, in real time, that every calculation he'd made was wrong. Ms. Vega stepped forward, her expression the particular iciness that comes from discovering you've been working in the same building as a federal crime. "Dr. Sterling," she said, and her voice could have frozen the Platte River solid. "You told us Senior Chief Morrison was an undertrained medical technician who endangered a patient with reckless and unauthorized procedure." The SEAL commander, because that's what he was, Katie understood now, cut in with the kind of calm authority that comes from having given orders that killed and saved in equal measure. "Senior Chief Morrison has more combat trauma experience than most military surgeons," he said. "That needle decompression in the mall? Flawless execution. Textbook response to a tension pneumothorax. She saved the ranger's life." Sterling's face drained white. The color didn't gradually fade. It simply evacuated, leaving him looking like something carved from old bone. There were protocols, insurance liability. I was following procedure?" The FBI agent stepped forward. She was smaller than Sterling, which made what happened next somehow more devastating. She held out another folder, this one thicker, heavier with consequence. "Dr. Sterling, we've been reviewing Cherry Creek Mall's medical billing records as part of a federal fraud investigation. Your name appears on $340,000 in irregular supply charges over 18 months. Defibrillator pads. Medications. Equipment that was billed to insurance but never actually used." Sterling's hands came up empty, no words to fill them. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. "That's..." he started. "That's not..." "I can explain." Ms. Vega's voice cut through like a scalpel. "You fired a decorated war hero to cover an embezzlement scheme." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Katie with the kind of respect that comes from finally understanding who you're actually standing next to. "Senior Chief Morrison, Denver General Medical Center has formally requested your expertise for their trauma unit. We're prepared to place you in a Navy consultation position, full benefits, effective immediately." The Navy officer extended papers, reinstatement documents. Katie understood, paperwork that would take her from invisible back into the light. Her hands took them, and for the first time in this room, there was a tremor. Not fear. Not weakness. The tremor was something else entirely. The tremor was 20 years of silence finally finding permission to speak. Captain Darwish stood with quiet pride. "She saved my life twice," he said, looking at Sterling. "Once 3 days ago with a pen in her hands, when my lung collapsed. And once 20 years ago in Tikrit, when she held the line so my unit could evacuate." His voice dropped lower. "She was my translator's son. That 6-year-old boy." He gestured toward the wheelchair. "Dr. Rashid Qasim. Now serving as Deputy Director of the Iraqi Ministry of Defense." Sterling tried to move toward the door. The security guard who'd walked Katie to her car 3 days ago with her cardboard box of belongings was already there, blocking the frame. He held an identical box, white and blank and devastating in its symmetry. He said nothing. He just extended it toward Sterling with the kind of courtesy that feels like execution. Sterling took it with trembling hands. Inside were his belongings, his credentials, what was left of his authority, now substantially reduced. As he turned to leave, Katie saw something else, her disciplinary notice, the one Pritkin had posted on the station's public bulletin board for every passing shopper to witness. He'd grabbed it. He'd kept it. Maybe as insurance. Maybe as a trophy. Either way, it was still in his hand as the guard walked him toward the corridor, and the staff who passed, the residents, the nurses, the orderlies, they all stared. They all saw. They all understood that the walk of shame Sterling had engineered for Katie now belonged to him, and there was no cardboard box heavy enough to hide in. 6 months moved past like helicopter rotors cutting through thin air. Katie Morrison walked through Denver General's trauma unit in Navy consultation scrubs, her collar insignia visible now, Senior Chief Petty Officer in gold lettering that caught the overhead light. Residents nodded when she passed. Not the nod of deference to a superior officer, but the nod of respect to someone who'd earned it in ways they were only beginning to understand. Her office was on the 3rd floor, with a window overlooking the city where the mountains rose in the distance like guardian sentinels. On her shelf, no longer hidden, those worn combat boots stood displayed with the ceremony they deserved. They were weathered, dust-stained, scarred from 20 years of roads that didn't exist on any map. Beside them sat a framed photograph. 2 images in one frame, a 6-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, his eyes wide with shock and trust, looking up at hands that held him steady. And beside it, the same boy at 54, in a diplomatic suit, standing with Katie at a military ceremony, both of them smiling. Emma had visited the office after school, beaming with a pride that transformed her entire face. She'd touched the medals on the wall, the Navy Cross first, her small hand trembling slightly, and asked questions Katie could finally answer without reservation. No more secrets. No more invisible life. Just the truth, standing in daylight, and a daughter who understood that the quiet person you lived with had held nations together. Captain Darwish stopped by weekly, bringing coffee from a place he'd discovered that made it the way Katie preferred. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who'd already survived the worst that history could offer. He'd been transferred to the Denver recruiting station, and his presence in her office became something like an anchor, a reminder that saving lives was what she did, what she'd always done, even when the world had tried to erase her for it. Dr. Sterling taught CPR certification at a community college on the East Side, minimum wage, his medical credentials revoked, his career dismantled with the same precision he'd used to build it. Federal charges were pending. The insurance fraud case had expanded like ripples in dark water, eventually catching 2 board members from Cherry Creek Mall and a hospital administrator who'd helped bury the complaints. The mall itself installed new medical protocols and brought in actual medical staff with actual qualifications and actual ethical frameworks. One morning, Katie's phone rang with a Pentagon number. Another consultation. Another specialist mission. Another place where the country needed someone who'd held the line when the line was collapsing. She touched the combat boots before she answered, remembering Tikrit, remembering the weight of that 6-year-old boy in her arms, remembering 20 years of carrying a secret that had finally learned how to breathe. She locked her office, and through the glass, the boots were visible on their shelf, displayed, honored, no longer hidden. The helicopter was already landing on the pad below, its rotors washing sound through the windows like coming home. Katie picked up her bag and headed toward the trauma bay where the future was waiting, where there were still people to save, still lines to hold, still wars being fought in the dark spaces where heroes don't get medals because no one ever knows they were there. The truth was finally standing in daylight. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, if you believe hidden strength deserves to be seen, please subscribe to this channel and share this video. Let us know in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to discover you were dead wrong? Because the world needs more people willing to look deeper.